Well, I'll kick us off then. Hi, everyone. Thank you to those of you who've joined us today and those of you who will be watching this later. Um, I am excited to introduce Julia Kavicki, who is here from the Rich Earth Institute. Julia is the education director at Rich Earth. They're a nonprofit based in Brattleboro, Vermont. And Julia reached out to me a few months back about this idea of hosting this Urine My Garden webinar, just as a way of talking about peecycling as a sustainable agricultural practice to reclaim bodily nutrients as a resource. And they received a grant to share education in the Lake Champlain watershed, which includes us here in Champlain Valley in Addison County. And so I'm very grateful that Julia reached out and is willing to teach us more about this today. My name's Emily. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Middlebury Co-op. And so I'm grateful that you're all here today. Thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, thanks so much to the Middlebury Co-op for hosting this webinar. And yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about kind of the scope of my presentation today, and then we'll have some time for discussion or questions if you have any at the end as well. So I'm going to kind of give you a big picture overview of kind of what's happening in the nutrient landscape with our human nutrients and the kind of alternate futures they might have. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at the community scale down in Brattleboro, and then what you can do in your own backyard to reclaim your urine as a free fertilizer for your own garden. So without further ado, I'll get my slides showing here. Are folks seeing the front page of some slides? Great. So to start off, we kind of have to think about what happens with the kind of conventional system that we often call in the sanitation sphere the flush and forget system, where we have sewer and septic systems that were designed really well to remove organic matter and pathogens. And when functioning properly, they can do that really well. But often these systems still release a vast majority of the nutrients in our waste, along with many other contaminants, especially combined in sewer systems where we're combining our human waste along with other kinds of industrial and manufacturing wastes. And that can all end up contributing to forms of pollution downstream. Um, so here in Vermont in particular, we kind of have a division of two main watersheds with two main kind of nutrient pollutants of concern. So down in southern Vermont, we're in the Connecticut River watershed, where our excess nutrients from our waste travel down the Connecticut River and go to the Long Island Sound. And in that coastal ecosystem, nitrogen is the main pollutant of concern that contributes to nutrient pollution problems. And then up in the kind of northern half of Vermont, in the Lake Champlain watershed, phosphorus is really the big pollutant of concern in the Lake Champlain, in Lake Champlain. And as it accumulates, it contributes to a wide array of kind of ecological problems there. And in Vermont in particular, we have a huge volume of homes that are on septic systems. Our state actually has the highest proportion of septic systems in the country, which kind of leads to particularly challenging issues for trying to address reducing some of this nutrient pollution. So when in these watersheds, whether in the freshwater ecosystems or in the saltwater ecosystems, these nutrients end up fertilizing harmful algal blooms. And harmful algal blooms are really a rising problem across the country as climate change and warmer waters are leading to more of these nutrient pollution events and also leading to more beneficial conditions for these blooms to occur. And harmful algal blooms can then produce neurotoxins that accumulate in shellfish, and they also deoxygenate the water and result in mass fish kills, and really just are kind of not a great end result for the fate of what's happening with the nutrients from our human waste. So together we think of all of these steps along the train as part of a linear flow, or what we think of as a broken cycle. So at every step along this train, there are ramifications environmentally and societally in terms of what we're doing to procure and then dispose of our nutrients. Just gonna mute folks who aren't talking, but we'll have time for discussion at the end. And thanks to folks who just joined. We're going through kind of the big picture of what's happening with our nutrient flows, and then we're going to talk about the specifics of how you can do this at a community or home scale in terms of reclaiming our nutrients. So to produce fertilizer, specifically nitrogen fertilizer, the vast majority of nitrogen fertilizer is produced through the Haber-Bosch process, which is an incredibly energy-intensive process that contributes about 1 to 2% to global greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, to produce phosphorus fertilizer, phosphorus is available in very limited amounts in rock form and is mined in a very extractive process that also has kind of negative societal implications. So once we produce those nutrient fertilizers and use them to grow our food, we then eat the food and grow our bodies, and whatever excess nutrients our bodies didn't need, we excrete out largely into water flushing toilets. And we've calculated that to flush toilets alone, we contribute about 900 billion gallons of water every year is wasted to flush human waste alone in the U.S. or urine alone. And so then that small amount of human waste and large amount of clean potable water is sent into wastewater treatment plants, where they then have to treat that huge volume and remove the pathogens. And in the US in particular, our wastewater treatment plants are really underfunded and overloaded. And especially as we think about smart growth in Vermont and village centers needing to receive more people in smaller areas, this really asks a lot of our wastewater treatment systems that are already overloaded. And they are very energy intensive systems and often very expensive to maintain or improve. So this is kind of the situation of what we call the linear flow of our nutrients. And here at Rich Earth and at many other places around the world, we instead try to reconnect the dots to reclaim the food nutrient cycle or complete the food nutrient cycle so that our nutrients can remain kind of in perpetual local systems rather than having to be extracted from faraway places and then sent to faraway places to be treated. So I love to share the fact that Rich Earth has calculated, actually based off of a King Arthur baking recipe, that every day the average adult body produces enough urine fertilizer to grow the wheat required to bake one loaf of bread. And I think this is just kind of a really lovely way of visualizing the potential for reciprocity between ourselves and the land, where the land can feed us in abundance what we might want to eat in a day, and then we can send those nutrients back to the land to grow more plants. And so I'll just give you a few examples of other places around the world that are using urine as a fertilizer to show the kind of scope of how common this has been throughout human experience and how widespread it is, even though it may seem like a little bit of an innovative or new kind of practice. So as one example, in South Central Niger, there's a federation of farmer unions that have joined together to do a farmer-to-farmer education project, sharing resources about how to use urine as a fertilizer to help small-scale farmers grow more food for their families. And they did an interesting thing here of renaming the urine fertilizer to increase the social acceptance of it. And so they called it Oga, which in the Igbo language means the boss, which I thought is kind of a cool rebranding and way of increasing the social acceptability of urine fertilizer. And there are now 3,000 farmers in South Central Niger using urine as a fertilizer. And then kind of in the larger scale context, the Swiss Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology is working on a range of building scale kind of high-tech treatment technologies to install in buildings for urban contexts. And AVOG has been kind of one of the pioneers and early research institutes that ignited a lot of academic interest around the world to focus on urine diversion and source separation. And they have a urine fertilizer product called Urine, which is now sold to small gardeners throughout Europe. And then there are many different projects in the US focusing on what we might call circular sanitation, including up in Burlington, a new portable toilet business called Wasted, which is working towards using their portable toilets to collect urine and use that as a fertilizer for a farm up in that area. So why focus on urine specifically? Well, here you can see that urine contains just a small sliver of the total volume that makes up wastewater, but it contains a vast majority of the nitrogen and the phosphorus. So by doing a relatively small act volume-wise of diverting urine at the source, we can have a relatively big impact on preventing that downstream nutrient pollution and also on reclaiming that amount of nutrients to support local farms. But you'll see on the far right that urine does contain about half of the micropollutants in wastewater, And what we're talking about here is really the pharmaceutical compounds that end up in urine. So I'll just spend a moment explaining some of our thinking and research around this question, because I know it's a big one that many people have and want to hear addressed before we talk about how to actually reclaim urine as a fertilizer. So first, I think it's important to think about what happens to the pharmaceuticals in our waste in that conventional linear flow, where they largely aren't removed by wastewater treatment plants or by septic systems and can end up accumulating also in these downstream aquatic ecosystems and have ecological effects on the species that live there, including changing fish physiology and fish behavior, and with ramifying effects up the food chain. So that's kind of not a great end effect of our pharmaceuticals in our waste. If we think about the alternate of reclaiming our urine as a fertilizer, this of course raises new questions about what might be happening to those pharmaceutical compounds in the soil or in the crop tissue or in the groundwater. And this is a question that Rich Earth has actually studied for 6 years in a research project that was in part funded by the National Science Foundation in partnership with the University of Michigan and the University of Buffalo and the Hampton Roads Sanitation District. And basically what this study found was that the pharmaceuticals really are not uptaken in the crops at any kind of significant level. So one way to accumulate the tininess of the pharmaceuticals they detected is that you'd have to eat a pound of urine fertilized lettuce every day for 1,000 years to get the same amount of caffeine that's in 1 cup of coffee. And this is kind of the worst case scenario because, of course, caffeine is one of the highest, most prevalent drug compounds that may be found in urine. And then they also found that there were even smaller levels of these compounds in the soil, in the parts per billion range, and even smaller than that in the groundwater. And this is quite comparable to what you might expect to find in the septic system, for example, which is kind of what's already happening a lot throughout Vermont. But this is definitely an area we're continuing to research, particularly around what the long-term soil health effects might be, especially as we think that it may be the soil microbes that are helping to break down and degrade these compounds, and we want to know what the long-term effect of doing that work for us may be. All right, so now I'll shift gears a little bit and tell you a little about what we're doing at the community scale for recycling urine down in Brattleboro, Vermont. And then I'll tell you about how you can do this at the home scale or in your home garden, anywhere and you live. If you have pea and land and plants to grow, you can also learn how to peecycle. So at the community scale, Rich Earth has been running our demonstration program, which we call our urine nutrient reclamation program, for the past 10 years, since around 2012, a little more than 10 years. And this is the first and largest community scale peecycling program of its kind in the country. And it serves as a platform for a wide range of research that we do and also our education. And every year now we collect about 12,000 gallons of urine for local farms from local participants. And in doing this work, we've reclaimed about 2.3 million gallons of clean water by preventing all of those toilets from being flushed and instead having urine collected in dry containers. So just very briefly, what this program entails is mainly 3 steps: collection, treatment, and then fertilization. So to collect our urine, we have 3 main means of collecting urine. The most prevalent is through these little portable urine collectors, which I'll tell you more about later. We have about 240 people in the local community who use these and bring them to one of our depots that have a vacuum pump station for pumping out the urine, and then people bring their empty containers home and keep peecycling. We also offer urine diverting toilet installations in both residential and public facilities. We just installed a urine collecting waterless urinal in the Hermit Thrush Brewery in Brattleboro. So if you're ever in Brattleboro and want to contribute, that's one place to visit. We also have a urine diverting Vostman in the Westminster West Public Library. And we just come and pump out those locations a couple of times a year and bring those nutrients back to our facility. And then we also have our own fleet of urine diverting portable toilets, sort of like what Wasted is doing up in Burlington, down in our area, and there are sawdust composting and urine collecting toilets that we have for local events and farmers markets and things of that ilk. For treatment, we bring all of the urine back to our facility and we pasteurize it with this pasteurizer, which is largely recommended for more community scale applications or for any time you're going to use urine for a public location like a farm. But is not required for home use. And I'll tell you more about that later as well. And then we have 9 local farm partners that we've worked with over the years who've trialed our urine fertilizer on a wide variety of crops. We're always doing different research projects with different farmers, often funded by the USDA's Sustainable Agriculture and Research and Education Program, just to continuously learn more about how to apply urine on different kinds of crops and working with different farmers to do so. And then we have a for-profit spin-off company called Brightwater Tools that's working on developing technologies for building scale installations of urine collecting or vacuum flush toilets. So they're working on a number of technologies, including the pasteurizer I showed you earlier, and also a freeze concentrator, which is a really interesting technology to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of a urine recycling system because it reduces a lot of the water in the urine and enables you to transport concentrated urine fertilizer over any distance from a building to a farm without having to have that much kind of transportation going on. So just very briefly, some of the research, one of the earliest research projects we did with a hay farm partner was comparing the effect of urine fertilizer to synthetic fertilizer, just to demonstrate that it can indeed work effectively as a fertilizer product. So they compared undiluted urine, diluted urine, no fertilizer, and synthetic fertilizer. And they found that largely the urine had the same impact on increasing hay yield as the synthetic fertilizer, which is a really encouraging result to see. And you can even see in this image, the bright green strip down the center is the urine fertilized strip, and the strip beside it is the non-fertilized strip. And since then, there have been many studies, actually from around the world, of researchers looking at the effect of urine fertilizer on different kinds of crops, everything from bananas to tomatoes to, if you name it, if you can think of it, it's possible that someone has researched it. But it's also something that we're continuing to study with new research partnerships that we have over the years as well. This is a drone shot of a recent other hay farm we fertilized. You can see the bottom half is a little darker green and the top half is a little more yellowy. This is a corn farm partner we worked with recently. We retrofitted a tractor to apply the urine as he went down the rows. And this is some of the corn at a recent field day we had. I can personally attest that this is some of the sweetest corn I have ever tasted. I don't know if it's entirely because of the urine fertilizer or something else, but truly delectable, and definitely the urine fertilization made for a wonderful corn crop that year. This is a little more anecdotal, but we partnered with a hemp farmer, and he was growing the hemp for a particular variety of CBD called CBDV. And just from some tissue samples that he took of the hemp, he found that there was a 32% increase in the CBDV content from the urine fertilizer. So it's a little on the more anecdotal side of things, but definitely very intriguing and something that would be interesting to research more in the future as well. And then we are also trialing this anthrovermiponic system, which uses worm tea from worms growing in these compost drawers and combines that with urine fertilizer to grow lettuce or other greens in this largely hydroponic growing system. And this is a system that was designed by an organization based in California called the Dark Nectar Co-op. And it is kind of an interesting way of using urine as a fertilizer, especially when we think about where in the country a lot of the urine is accumulated, and that is in urban areas. And so thinking about how to use urine fertilizer for urban agricultural contexts, so you're not having to transport large amounts of urine out of the city to farms, is kind of intriguing to us. And it's been working really well, and we've been donating a lot of our produce to FoodWorks, a local food distribution hub in Brattleboro. Okay, now I will shift gears a little bit and tell you about some of the properties of urine as a fertilizer that are important to know before trying to do this in your own backyard. And then I'll go through the steps of how you might go about urine fertilizing your own plants yourself. So the first thing to know about urine fertilizer is the NPK value, which is something that Rich Earth has calculated or has had tested on our community collected urine and is comparable to what other folks have tested for their urine other places in the world, which is 0.6, 0.1, 0.2. Now this will vary slightly depending on your diet, actually. If you have a higher protein diet, you'll have more nitrogen in your urine, which is interesting to note. But generally, this is a good NPK value to use for any calculations you might want to do about how much urine to apply to which crops. One important thing to know about the form of nitrogen in urine is this process called ammonia volatilization. And if you don't remember anything else that I say from here on out, I think this is the most important thing to know about using urine as a fertilizer, which is that the nitrogen in urine is highly susceptible to being lost to the air anytime urine is exposed to air. So you really want to minimize air exposure throughout your entire process, from collection to storage to applying in your garden. Basically, the urea in urine can convert to ammonia and be lost to the air. And this will also, and preventing ammonia volatilization will also increase your enjoyment of the experience, because the like smelliness of urine that you experience is the smell of ammonia. Another property of urine is that it does contain some amount of salt. So it's important to just sort of observe for any potential salt accumulation that might be happening. Generally, in our region, the rate of precipitation is great enough that any potential salts will be flushed through your soil and not be an issue. But if you're growing in an arid climate, or if you're growing in a hoop house, for example, you might want to just watch for signs of salt accumulation and flush your garden with water if you start to notice it becoming an issue. So, for going about actually procuring your urine fertilizer, there are a wide range of means that people go about collecting their urine. Everywhere from, on the far left, DIY collection methods. In our community science survey, people report often using laundry detergent bottles, especially wide mouth laundry detergent bottles can be an easy way to collect, or kitty litter containers, or things like the luggable loo, or any kind of plastic bottle. I'll work just fine. In the middle, Rich Earth has designed this peecycling kit, which is basically a 2.5 or 5 gallon container with a funnel that has watertight fittings that are concatenated plumbing parts that we've put together over the years. And this method seems to work very well. Many of our urine donors have one of these in their bathrooms, and you can either stand to pee or squat to pee with them. You can also use a nun's cap, which just sort of fits under your toilet seat, and you can pee into that and then pour that into the funnel. Or you can use a pee style or any kind of stand to pee personal urination device to make it easier to collect your urine in a container like this. And we also give them out with spouts that fit to the container, so you can easily then get the urine out of your large container and into your watering can when you're in your garden. And then there are also more kind of permanent options. There's urine diverting toilets of many varieties. There are flushing urine diverting toilets, and also dry composting urine diverting toilets. And then we've partnered with a local compost toilet business, Toilet for People, to design this sit to pee only toilet, which is a nice option that you can have in your bathroom as well. And if you visit toiletsforpeople.com, you can learn more about procuring one of those. And I think it's kind of fun to note that every full 5 gallons of urine that you collect conserves an average of 100 gallons of water from being flushed. So while it may look like a relatively small act in terms of what volume you've collected, you can imagine the huge volume of water that would have been wasted otherwise if you had been using a flush toilet. So then in our peecycling, little peecycling kits, we have a couple of steps that we recommend to help prevent odor from being an issue in your bathroom. You can also do similar things with other collection units you may use. Largely, this consists of acidifying your urine, or adding some acid to your container before adding urine to it. And we recommend about 1 or 2 cups of white vinegar per 5-gallon container, or about 1 tablespoon of citric acid. And this just helps to keep the pH low enough that it prevents the ammonia volatilization from occurring. Our funnels also have a ball pit that sits in a ball pit ball that sits in the center of them, which basically acts as a check valve so that the urine can enter the container, but no odors or gases leave the system. So then the next thing to think about before actually going and fertilizing your garden is whether or not you want to sanitize. So largely, as I mentioned earlier, sanitization is necessary for farms or other public contexts, and required by law in Vermont to sanitize the urine. So the way we do that is with the Brightwater Tools pasteurizer, which we sell to larger scale contexts, like Wasted up in Burlington has one of these pasteurizers that they're using. Or you can use the storage method. And to do this, you just store your urine in an airtight container at roughly room temperature for 6 months. And this is according to the World Health Organization guidelines for using urine as a fertilizer. And that will just raise the pH in the urine high enough that it will kill any potential pathogens that are in it. But if you want to use your urine in your home garden for your own household's consumption, urine is actually entirely pathogen-free from healthy people. So you can use your urine straight away in your garden and not have to worry about needing to sanitize it. And it's just generally recommended to wait at least 30 days after you've fertilized before you harvest any crops that are to be eaten raw. And that's again per those World Health Organization guidelines. But yeah, you can just pee straight in your garden if you want to. Some people do that, and that's just fine. But it's also important to note, like if you're using urine from a urine diverting toilet, it's generally recommended to sanitize because there's a little potential for cross contamination. So it also kind of depends on what exact collection method you're using. All right, so you followed all the steps, you've collected your urine, and now you're in your garden and ready to fertilize. The next thing that you want to think about is when is the best time to fertilize which plants you're growing. So this is an example of a nitrogen uptake curve of a wheat plant. And generally, you want to be fertilizing your plant when its nitrogen uptake curve is the greatest, because nitrogen is the greatest nutrient content of urine, and therefore can have, you want to apply it when the plant has its greatest nitrogen needs. So generally, this is any time between when the plant is older than a seedling and younger than a fruiting or flowering plant, because the nitrogen will stimulate more sort of leafy green shooty growth, and you don't want to do that when the plant is trying to switch its energy to focusing on flowering and fruiting. But many people also find success with adding a little urine fertilizer after they've just transplanted their seedlings. You just want to make sure it's a very small amount so you're not accidentally burning the plant. And generally, we recommend to apply your urine fertilizer in several small applications, so you're giving the plants the nutrients as they need them and not overloading them with too much at once. And then in terms of which plants to fertilize, generally any plant that has high nitrogen needs is a great recipient for urine fertilizer. Some people fertilize fruit trees, which is a great use if you have especially a lot of urine fertilizer sitting around. It's recommended to just apply in roughly the same diameter as the canopy of the tree, which is a good estimate of where the plant roots might be growing. And this summer, actually, we're partnering with a local nut farmer and applying some of their nut tree seedlings, which is, exciting new farm partnership we're working on. Some people also will fertilize houseplants with a small amount. There's a company in France that's designed a system that works well for this called the solar dripper, which is basically just a small spike that sits in the soil that screws into a soda bottle. And that can be a nice, and you add your dilute urine and water into the soda bottle, and that can be a nice way to add the nutrients to the soil of your houseplant without having any potential odor issues. Because you will smell for some amount, maybe a few hours after you apply, there will be some detectable odor of the urine fertilizer. So that's just kind of an important aspect to be aware of, which is largely the ammonia volatilization kind of residually happening. So when you're in your garden applying, the most important thing in terms of how to apply is preventing any spraying from happening, because the more spraying action that happens as you pour the urine, the more the urine is exposed to air and the more ammonia volatilization happens, or you lose some of the nitrogen value. So we recommend pouring the urine as close to the ground as possible. In our watering can at home, I just unscrew the little end nozzle of it so that it comes out in one steady stream. And we recommend to incorporate the urine into moist soil or into soil through whatever means you choose to do. So one way to do this is to make a shallow hole or furrow next to your plants, at least 4 inches away from the base of your plant, and then apply the urine in that furrow and then cover it over with soil. Another way to go about this is to apply in your garden and then immediately water your garden afterward, or apply during or just before the rain. Or you can dilute your urine before application and mix it with water before applying to your garden. And all of these methods achieve the general goal of incorporating the urine into the soil and having it at the plant roots where they need them, rather than sitting at the top. So how much urine fertilizer to apply is really a question of 3 main factors, and that is the nutrient content of your urine, the nutrient content of your soil, and the nutrient needs of your plants. So you can think about knowing the NPK value of the urine, and if you want to go about getting a soil test from your garden, you can work with the UVM Extension Office to get a soil test done, and then also knowing the nutrient needs of your plants, you can do kind of intricate calculations of exactly how much urine fertilizer to apply. Or you can sort of use the observation method of just generally looking for signs of nitrogen deficiency in your plants and applying based on that. So if they have yellowy or pale leaves or stunted growth at a time when you would expect them to have more rapid growth, you can apply the urine fertilizer then. A very general rule of thumb is about a gallon of urine per 1,000 square feet. That should be 1,000 every couple of weeks, which is sort of what we use for our hay fields in our larger scale application. And then a note on dilution, as I mentioned earlier, this is a good way to help the urine soak into the ground and be incorporated into the soil, especially if you have dry soil. And the most common levels are around 1 part urine to 3 or 5 parts water, but really anywhere between 1 to 1 to 30 has been tried. It's really more of an art than a science, and something that people are continuing to experiment with in home gardens. And it, yeah, depends a lot on your particular garden and what you're using the urine for. But dilution is a good way to also help prevent against accidentally over fertilizing or burning as well. One other application method is if you happen to have a drip irrigation system set up in your garden, adding urine and water to a drip irrigation system to fertigate your garden is a good way to get the urine to soak into the soil where the plant roots need them, and also helps prevent the ammonia volatilization from occurring. And this is something that we researched with a recent USDA SARE grant and are continuing to look into as a good kind of low labor urine fertilization method. Another thing folks often ask is, or tell us, is that they often will just pee straight into their compost pile while you're out in your garden. And whether or not this is a good way to actually retain the nutrients in your urine really depends on the nutrient content of your compost heap. So if you have a high nitrogen content compost pile, something with a lot of kitchen scraps or green plant material, then it's actually not going to retain the nutrients in your urine very well, because it's sort of like a full sponge and the urine will largely just trickle through and not be retained. But if you have a high carbon content compost heap, so lots of straw or dead leaves or other dry, dead plant material, then adding urine can be a great context for using the nutrients in your urine. And it can actually accelerate the composting process, which is something that some of our partners in upstate New York have been looking into, called Compost for Good, is using urine and compost to produce a really high value nutrient-rich compost. Other recipes that people have tried, in addition to urine and compost, are urine and biochar. Emily and I were talking about that earlier. Biochar can really absorb the nutrients in urine, and urine can activate the biochar. And so that can be a good method and something that folks have tried. Or if you apply wood ash and then also urine to your soil, the wood ash can add some of the potassium that urine isn't quite as high in. Some folks use urine in straw bale gardening. Our partners at Cornell University have been trying that kind of on the small scale, and that can accelerate the decomposition of the straw bale and feed the microbes in the straw. Or you can combine urine and wood chips to biodegrade the woody material and help slow their release of nitrogen. So really a lot of different things people are trying, and a really active area of research academically as well, looking at combining urine fertilizer with different kinds of soil amendments. So that's kind of the end of the physical steps of urine fertilizing your home garden, but we recommend adding the additional virtual step of completing our community science survey, which is really a good way for us to learn about how people are fertilizing with urine in their own home gardens, like where they're doing it and how much urine they're using and what plants you're fertilizing. Because while on the academic level, there's a lot of research into the sort of agricultural scale of urine fertilization, there's not very much known about how people are doing this on the home scale in your own home garden. And so this will really help us grow that body of knowledge, and also just kind of open up the conversation about how many people are doing this in so many places, and really demonstrating that. So this is one of the questions in our community science survey. It's really interesting to see the wide range of responses that people have had to this. One of the most interesting things for me has been some of the sort of side benefits that people report in terms of using urine fertilizer to deter pests, like rats, for example, or deer is something people often report. And also some people have found that using urine fertilizer causes less insect damage to certain plants, which is really interesting to see as well. Another question is whether or not people talk about using urine fertilizer in their home gardens. And I think it's also really interesting to see the broad range of responses people have here, from folks who will fertilize in the dead of night and don't want their neighbors to know, to people sort of in the middle who won't necessarily tell anybody. But when people ask why their tomato plants are looking so particularly lush that year, they'll say, "Oh, it's because I've been using this secret ingredient. Let me tell you about it." And then on the far other end, people who will invite people over and show them how they're doing it and welcome them into their bathrooms to contribute their nutrients that way. So really a broad range of approaches in terms of talking about it socially. And then if you happen to have friends or family or know of people who live in our Bellows Falls or Brattleboro area, we're always looking to grow our community peacycling program on that scale. And we're also interested in supporting other communities and getting this sort of larger scale peacycling infrastructure set up. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we would love to talk about supporting getting more depots and more processing facilities going in other places as well. And then if you are interested in this peacycling kit that I described, through our Lake Champlain Basin program funding, we have a certain amount of free kits available for folks in the Lake Champlain watershed. So if you would like one, please send me an email. You'll have my email. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who attended today, so you can learn more about that if you would like to use this as a method for collecting your fertilizer for your backyard garden. And we also have a Facebook group to encourage people who are trying this out to connect together. So you can join our Urine My Garden Facebook group to share what you're trying or ask any questions of other at-home peacyclers. And then help us grow the peacycling movement. We have some more upcoming events. Most notably, our Rich Earth Summit is an annual event for researchers from around the world and local practitioners to come together and talk about urine nutrient reclamation. That's going to be November 7 to 9 this year, and we just opened our registration today, actually. We're going to be having a public tour of our Brattleboro recycling program on the first day, and on the second day, we're going to be having an open house at a research center in Brattleboro. So if you'd like to come and connect with other peacycling enthusiasts, that's a good day to come down and do that. And then, of course, we encourage everyone to take our community science survey and help us learn about how you're doing this and what you're trying in your own home garden. And then, of course, if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter or social media, those are also ways to stay connected. So without further ado, I will bring us all back together, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments anyone might have about peacycling at any scale. Yeah.
I have a question. First of all, thank you so much. That was super informative and interesting and exciting. I have a question about the nutrient content. Aside from NPK, is there a lot of research on other like micronutrient phytochemical composition when urine is applied to gardens as a fertilizer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in our home garden guide, we actually have the full nutrient breakdown of urine. So it contains not just NPK, but also a wide range of micronutrients like magnesium and other micronutrients that plants might need, which I think is a really interesting thing that differentiates it from conventional fertilizers you might buy in the store, where it actually does have a more complete set of nutrients that plants need to grow. While it has those nutrients in very small levels, often plants only need them in small levels. So it's kind of cool to note that as a differentiating factor from like just buying urea, for example. Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you. Julia, if folks have questions after we conclude today, is it okay to reach out to you with those?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll send out an email with links to some of the resources I mentioned. So you can just reply to that to me if you have any private questions you'd like to ask there also.
Great.
Could I ask a question? So just to be clear, for home collection, if you collect your urine and you can put it, you can dilute it and put it on your garden immediately,
Yeah.
rather than having to keep a collection going and storage.
Yeah, I think actually the sooner you apply it to your garden rather than storing it, you kind of have more of the nutrients that stay in your urine rather than potentially being lost to the air through the storage process. But yeah, that definitely is
Okay.
a good way
And
to-
if by mishap you end up with feces as well, then you should just discard it.
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Great.
I saw a question come in the chat about whether or not there are programs like this in North Carolina. Does Rich Earth Institute have any partner organizations in other parts of the country?
Yeah, nothing. So we're the only sort of community peecycling program, specifically of our kind in the country. I know there are some researchers at the University of North Carolina who are looking into different kind of sanitation methods, but nothing I know at the community scale. There is a budding program we're working to support in the Cape Cod area, since Cape Cod has such big nutrient pollution problems. They're looking at a potentially very expensive sewer system expansion there. And we have some friends at the Green Center who are working to promote urine diversion as a much more affordable and kind of environmental way of diverting nutrients, and then also actually reclaiming a resource to provide local farmers. So they've been working on getting a program going there. And then there's an eco village in Oregon called Kailash Eco Village that diverts their urine and uses that in their eco village there. And there are a few other kind of budding community programs that we're working to support. But yeah. And then in my follow-up email, I'll include a copy of the slides. So if there's anything that I went too quickly over, you can go back and peruse that. And then we'll also be putting this recording on YouTube so that anyone who wants to check that out can rewatch it there as well. Yeah.
I have another follow-up question. I understand that I know the Rich Earth Institute does some work with human manure collection, which involves solid waste, not just the liquid waste. But I also understand that there are still some challenges with regard to a legal pathway for collecting and using human manure. And I understand that there was some legislation introduced this year that would create a legal pathway based on existing laws in the state of Maine. And I kind of lost track of whether or not those received any airtime in the past legislative session. Do you happen to know anything about that?
Yes, it's a great question. So for a brief sort of summary, in Vermont, currently while it's totally legal to have a compost toilet, there are only 3 allowable options for what you then do with the solids of those toilets. One is to bring it to a landfill, one is to bring it to a wastewater treatment plant, and one is to apply for a shallow burial permit, where the site for the shallow burial has to meet the specifications for a leach field, which is often challenging for homeowners. So we introduced a bill as part of the Vermont Ecological Sanitation Working Group to create best management practices for composting compost toilet solids at home and putting the ing in composting toilets in partnership with regulators. And that unfortunately did not get out of committee in the House this year. I think they were just really overloaded with a lot of bills this year. I think they had something like 200 to review. So very understandable, but we are in communication with legislators about paths forward for this. And I think the subcommittee is one of the members of that subcommittee is organizing a tour of infrastructure in Vermont, and they are going to include a visit to Rich Earth and some of our processes as part of that tour. So we're definitely working to collaborate towards that. And then also outside of the legislative action, really interested in continuing to collaborate with regulators to talk about what a pathway towards creating best management practices might be.
I very much appreciate those efforts. I also see another question in the chat. As a one-person household, how long would it take to accumulate enough to be worth it? And is there such a thing as storing it for too long? How long until the nutrients degrade? Can you accumulate all winter and then consider yourself stocked up for spring? What does that look like?
Yeah. I'd say to the first question, I think it really depends on the scale of garden that you're talking about. So if you're growing a like relatively small or medium scale home garden, definitely the amount of urine you make in a year can be more than enough for the garden, especially if you're collecting during the winter. And as long as you're storing your urine in a airtight, watertight container, it won't go bad per se. It'll contain all of the nutrients that in the other parts of the year when you want to use it. You just want to make sure if your urine is going to be stored outside, if it's going to freeze, it's okay for the urine to freeze, but you want to make sure there's enough room in your container for that ice to expand. You don't want to encounter any issues there. There's an interesting thing about stored urine that it will change color. It turns a kind of darker color, which is concerning to some people, but isn't a sign that anything has gone wrong. It's just a natural process that occurs. Yeah.
There was another question in the chat about solid waste composting and you know, whether it would be healthy as long as a person wasn't taking prescription drugs or, you know, eating chemically laden foods. And my understanding is it would probably be similar to collection of urine in that as long as it's being composted properly and heating up to a proper temperature, it's burning out any pathogens that may exist in that resulting compost.
Yeah, and I think generally the easiest fail-safe way of ensuring that any pathogens in the solids are killed is actually through time. So if you store the solids of your compost toilet for about 2 years, that's a good way to, even if you don't achieve the heat, the time will kill the pathogens in it. But yeah.
Thank you.
How do you know if there are pathogens in it? Well, I think in if the it in question is urine, I'd say if you're a healthy individual, there shouldn't be any pathogens in it. There can be some kind of harmless bacteria that aren't a concern for using in your garden. But if you have like a UTI, for example, then there would be pathogens in your urine. And I think it's safe to assume that all feces that leave the body will have pathogens in them and definitely need to be stored for about 2 months. But again, there's no legal way to go about doing that in Vermont currently. But what Emily was mentioning earlier about rich earth solids composting is we have the first permit that we're aware of in the state and possibly even in the country for doing community compost toilet composting at our facility. And that's not something we have the infrastructure or the funding or the infrastructure to actually set up to do yet. But in the next year or so, we're hoping to have a in-vessel composter or a composter of some kind set up in Brattleboro so we can collect the solids from local people's compost toilets and bring them to our facility to compost, similarly to what we do with the urine fertilizer. Ooh, that's a good question. What will we do with the compost we collect? I don't think we've quite figured that out. I suppose we could make it available to the people who have the compost toilets if they want it back once it's certified as a Class A exceptional quality biosolid by the state of Vermont, which means it can be applied to any land safely. But yeah, we haven't quite gotten there. Currently, with our portable toilets that I was mentioning that are sawdust composting portable toilets, we collect the solids from them and bring them to the Claremont wastewater treatment facility, and they have a composting operation set up over there. And so that's what we do with them currently, but they would ultimately become part of our on-site composting. It's a good question. Will we be selling some of it to help our operations? Yeah, I think we haven't quite figured that out. For our urine, it's kind of been an interesting journey in terms of whether or not we sell it. For many years, and for most of our farm partners, we provide them the urine fertilizer for free, because just out of gratitude for them kind of trying this new thing with us and the extra time that it takes for a farmer to do a slightly different process than what they typically do. So, and also because most of our farm fertilizations are part of these USDA grants that we have. But this past growing season, we actually had our very first farmer reach out to us and offer to pay us for the urine fertilizer, because there's such a lack of local sustainable nitrogen fertilizer sources. So that was the first time we ever sold urine fertilizer to a farmer. But it's kind of an interesting conversation about, should bodily nutrients be commodified? And if so, who should decide about who they're sold to or how? I think it's many different organizations around the world take very different approaches to how they go about answering those questions.
What are some ways that those of us who are really excited about what you're doing, like how can we support your work and what you're doing at the Rich Earth Institute?
Oh, what a wonderful question. I think spreading the word about what we're trying to get going. If you know of people who might be interested in sort of at the community level replicating what we've done, and also helping to spread the word about our home gardening education, especially in sensitive watersheds where they have issues with nutrient pollution. We're working to get the word out about how people can do this in their own home gardens. And if you would like to contribute financially to the Rich Earth Institute, we always are welcoming financial donations as well. We have a donate button on our website for that also. Yeah.
Cool.
Emily?